President Obama's first 100 days in office make for compelling news stories, but what we should really focus on is how the first 100 days will affect us in our future. This will go down in history as the most expensive 100 days for the American people. Since his inauguration, President Obama has signed into law $1.19 trillion in new spending. That's $11.9 billion of spending for each day that he's been in office. And those figures don't include the $3.7 trillion budget for next year, a measure now awaiting final action on the Senate floor. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that if this budget is passed and signed into law, by 2019, the public debt will reach 82.4% of our gross domestic product. That means more new debt will be created under this one budget than all of the combined debt created by all of the previous 43 presidents, all the way back to President George Washington. His own advisors acknowledge that the budget will put us on an unsustainable course. It proposes a sweeping change of course for the U.S. economy that will shift the balance of power away from the private sector toward the federal government. It's not just the uncharted levels of spending and debt. This budget leaves higher taxes on every household in the form of a national energy tax that puts taxpayers on the hook to pay for a larger and more intrusive federal government. In other words, this budget spends too much, taxes too much, and borrows too much. On spending, President Obama has made his proposed new spending sound more palatable by describing it as an investment that will pay off by saving us money down the road. Most of the new spending, however, is for services and programs whose long-term value continues to be debated, nor is there any intention of cutting spending in the future. This budget does not propose one-time investments followed by years of reduced spending. Instead, billions in new outlays will continue indefinitely, meaning the permanent accruement of power in Washington. Rolling back the federal government's reach in the coming years could prove a Sisyphean challenge. Those of us in Washington need to keep in mind that families and small businesses now more than ever make sacrifices and trade-offs in their own budgets. Shouldn't Washington do the same? This budget continues business as usual, making no hard choices about how to rein in out-of-control government spending. In fact, the budget is so big that, according to the Heritage Foundation, 250,000 new federal bureaucrats may be required just to spend it all. Federal government employees represent the largest group of new jobs created under this bill. In response to concerns about spending, President Obama has instructed his cabinet to cut $100 million from the budget in the next 90 days. Wow, $100 million. That represents just 0.003% of the budget. Let me put it in context. It's hard to imagine an Arizona family using the same math to trim its budget. A typical Arizona family makes $47,215 per year. Say they would like a budget like the president's. That means their budget would be $71,848 in the coming year. But they have to cut 0.003% from it. That's $2.05. So they still have a debt of $24,631 to put on the family credit card. Unsustainable. No family would decide to do this. It wouldn't put them on a course for future prosperity. So we need to cut a lot more than the 0.003 from this budget to be fiscally sustainable. On the matter of taxes, the president has said he will cut taxes for 95% of Americans, but his budget would raise taxes by $1.4 trillion over the next 10 years. It would implement a new $646 billion energy tax that will affect every American household, regardless of income, and is estimated to increase energy costs for every family by as much as $3,168 annually. And it's described as a down payment, meaning there's much more to come. This tax is touted as a way to curb greenhouse gas emissions, but it will unavoidably tax virtually every economic activity, since almost every aspect of our daily lives requires energy from fossil fuels. I recall the president telling the San Francisco Chronicle, and I'm quoting here, "Under my plan of a cap-and-trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket." End of quote. Mr. President, how much time have I consumed, if I may ask?
5 minutes.
All right, let me move on to another part of my remarks here, and I'll ask unanimous consent that my entire remarks be put in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
The budget also lets some of the existing low tax rates expire, which also raises taxes, which also hurts our economy. We need to keep in mind that our economy is a complex and dynamic force. It's made up of individuals and small businesses and families deciding on how much they want to save and spend and invest, whether or not to create new jobs or open new businesses. Usually it resists policymakers' attempts to manipulate and control it. It's not a ball of clay that Washington can mold any way that it wants to and expect to never encounter any adverse results. There are negative consequences to what we do. And I guess I would conclude this point by saying that we're obviously straying too far from the principle that the purpose of taxes is to pay for the costs of government in a way that does the least damage to the economy. Now we're using the tax policy to redistribute wealth. How many activities or services can we now think of that the government does not tax or is not aiming to tax? Finally, Mr. President, there's the matter of borrowing too much, the debt and the deficit. In 5 years, this budget will double the public debt. In 10 years, it will triple the public debt. That's why we can say that just this one budget accumulates more debt than every president of the United States combined previous to now. The Congressional Budget Office projects that the president's budget will accumulate $9.2 trillion in deficits. That would raise the debt held by the public to an astonishing 82.4% of the gross domestic product in the year 2019. My colleague Senator McCain told us during the campaign that spending and deficits are two sides of the same coin, that President Obama's spending promises would raise deficits to unsustainable level, and that huge tax hikes, and not just for the wealthy, would be required to pay for it all. Now even the President's Office of Management and Budget Director, Peter Orszag, has confirmed what Senator McCain said all along. These levels of spending and deficits will not be sustainable. And let me quote here in conclusion an editorial comment from the Washington Post recently. President Obama's budget plan, it says, would have the government spending more than 23% of gross domestic product throughout the second half of this decade, while collecting less than 19% in revenue. End of quote. Is this the legacy that we want to leave the next generation? Unprecedented debt. Well, on this side of the aisle, the answer to that question is no. And that's why we're concerned about the effect of the past 100 days on our country's future. All of us in the Senate share the goal of getting the economy back on track. We need a budget that meets the test of fiscal responsibility. This budget does not. Moreover, it contradicts the President's campaign promises for a net spending reduction and no tax increases for 95% of Americans. And the unprecedented amounts of spending, taxing, and borrowing are sure to hinder an economic recovery. As President Reagan said, facts are stubborn things. We've seen throughout our country's history that increasing taxes and introducing new regulation during a recession has never led to economic growth. Why would this time be any different? Right now, Mr. President, we should be working on growing our economy, not growing the federal government.